Sometimes the biggest fights don't happen in court. They happen in your own backyard, especially when someone tries to take away what's rightfully yours. Stay with me, because what happened next will shock you, and it might even remind you of a time someone tried to push you around. HOA tried banning my wife's chickens. She owns their HOA farmland. People say a home is a peaceful place, but sometimes the real trouble starts when people believe they have more power than they actually do. It all began with a small argument, a simple misunderstanding, and a rule that was never meant to be used this way. My wife loved her chickens. She took care of them every day, fed them, talked to them, and treated them like family. For her, those chickens were not just animals. They were comfort, joy, and a part of her land that she worked hard to protect. One morning, everything changed. A letter from the HOA arrived, plain and cold, with sharp words and strict warnings. It said the chickens were not allowed. It said they must be removed. It said we were breaking the rules. But the strangest part was this: the land those chickens lived on belonged to my wife. It was part of her family history, a piece of her grandmother's old farm, land that existed long before any HOA was even created. When my wife read that letter, her hands shook. She was not angry at first. She was hurt, deeply hurt. You could see it in her eyes. You could hear it in her voice. For a woman who never asks for trouble, she suddenly found herself in the middle of a battle she never expected. I still remember how she looked at me that day, with tears gathering but not falling, and said, "Why would they do this when this land is mine?" That question stayed in my mind. It echoed through our home. And the more we talked about it, the stranger things became. How could someone try to control land they didn't own? How could they demand something from a place that was not their responsibility? It felt like someone was testing us. Someone was hoping we would just give up quietly. But my wife is not the kind of woman who gives up. Not when something means this much. Not when someone tries to take away what she loves. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and said, "No, I'm not letting them do this." In that moment, something strong awakened in her. Something brave. Something determined. So we decided to stand up. Not with anger. Not with shouting. But with truth. We pulled out old land records. We gathered papers from her grandmother. We checked maps, dates, and boundaries. The more we read, the clearer it became. The HOA had no right over that land. They had no control. They had no say. They were simply wrong. Still, we knew this fight would not be easy. People in power rarely admit mistakes quickly. And when a group like the HOA points a finger, they expect you to bow your head. But we were done bowing. We were ready to move forward with strength, respect, and proof. My wife held those land papers like they were pieces of her heart. Her voice was gentle but firm when she said, "They won't take this from me. Not again. Not ever." And in that moment, I realized this was more than a fight about chickens. It was a fight about respect, about dignity, about standing your ground, even when someone tries to push you down. We didn't know what the HOA would do next. We didn't know who was behind the complaint. But we knew one thing for sure. We were not going anywhere. We were ready to face whatever came next. Together.
After we gathered all the land papers, we thought the problem would end quickly. We believed that once the HOA saw the truth, they would admit their mistake and leave us alone. But life is not always that simple. Sometimes when people feel embarrassed, instead of fixing the situation, they make it worse. And that is exactly what happened to us next. A few days later, we received another letter. This one felt even colder, even more disrespectful, like someone was trying to show power they did not have. The letter said they reviewed the complaint. It said they were investigating further. And the worst part, it said they might issue fines if the chicken stayed. My wife sat at the kitchen table holding that paper, and for the first time, I saw something new in her eyes. Not just hurt, not just confusion, but disappointment. Deep disappointment. She whispered, "Why don't they understand that this land is not theirs?" I placed my hand over hers and told her, because some people don't want to understand. They want control. She nodded slowly, as if those words were heavy but true. That evening, we walked out to the chicken coop. The sun was low, soft golden light touching everything. The chickens clucked happily, unaware of the battle happening around them. My wife stood there quietly, listening to them, and I could tell she was thinking about her childhood, her grandmother, and the memories tied to that land. She said softly, "My grandmother trusted me with this place. She trusted me to protect it. Her voice cracked just a little. I won't let anyone disrespect her memory. The next day, we decided to visit the HOA office in person. We knew talking face-to-face would show them we were serious. No anger, no shouting, just truth. When we arrived, a few board members were sitting behind a long desk, wearing official badges like they were guarding a castle. They looked surprised to see us. Maybe they thought we would just accept their letters and stay quiet. My wife placed the land records on the table. She spoke calmly, with dignity, every word carrying strength. She explained the history of the land. She explained the boundaries. She explained why the chickens were allowed. She explained everything with clear evidence. But even then, one of the board members leaned back in his chair and said, "We still need to review this." That moment hurt, not because of the words, but because of the attitude. It was the kind of tone older people recognize immediately, the tone of someone who doesn't respect you, even when you are right. Someone who thinks power comes from a title, not from truth. My wife took a slow breath. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "Review it, but know this, I know my rights, and I will not let you take what is mine." Her voice was steady, firm, unshakable. We walked out of the office, and I could feel her strength growing even more. But deep inside, I also knew the HOA would not let this go easily. People who are wrong often get louder before they finally get quiet. And the board members had that look in their eyes, frustration, pride, and the fear of being proven wrong. 2 days passed, then 3, then a week. No answer, no call, no letter. Silence can sometimes feel heavier than anger. My wife waited every day, checking the mailbox, checking her email, hoping for a fair response. But nothing came. Finally, after 10 long days, we received a thick envelope from the HOA. This time, the letter was longer, full of complicated terms and confusing phrases, like they wanted to intimidate us with big words. But when we read it carefully, one thing became clear. They wanted to challenge us. They wanted to see if we would give up. They wanted to push harder. My wife looked at the letter, and instead of fear, I saw steel in her eyes. She folded the paper, placed it on the table, and said, "If they want to fight, then we will show them the truth in a way they cannot deny." And that was the moment everything changed. We decided to take the next step, a step they never expected, a step that would shake the entire HOA board, a step that would prove the land was hers, beyond all doubt. That HOA tried banning my wife's chickens. She owns her HOA farmland. Now, the rewritten Section 1, simple grade, 8 English, emotional, human, every line with punctuation. People say a home is a peaceful place. But sometimes the real trouble starts when people believe they have more power than they actually do. It all began with a small argument, a simple misunderstanding, and a rule that was never meant to be used this way. My wife loved her chickens. She took care of them every day, fed them, talked to them, and treated them like family. For her, those chickens were not just animals. They were comfort, joy, and a part of her land that she worked hard to protect. One morning, everything changed. A letter from the HOA arrived, plain and cold, with sharp words and strict warnings. It said the chickens were not allowed. It said they must be removed. It said we were breaking the rules. But the strangest part was this. The land those chickens lived on belonged to my wife. It was part of her family history, a piece of her grandmother's old farm, land that existed long before any HOA was even created. When my wife read that letter, her hands shook. She was not angry at first. She was hurt, deeply hurt. You could see it in her eyes. You could hear it in her voice. For a woman who never asked for trouble, she suddenly found herself in the middle of a battle she never expected. I still remember how she looked at me that day, with tears gathering but not falling, and said, "Why would they do this when this land is mine?" That question stayed in my mind. It echoed through our home. And the more we talked about it, the stranger things became. How could someone try to control land they didn't own? How could they demand something from a place that was not their responsibility? It felt like someone was testing us. Someone was hoping we would just give up quietly. But my wife is not the kind of woman who gives up. Not when something means this much. Not when someone tries to take away what she loves. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and said, "No, I'm not letting them do this." In that moment, something strong awakened in her. Something brave. Something determined. So we decided to stand up, not with anger, not with shouting, but with truth. We pulled out old land records. We gathered papers from her grandmother. We checked maps, dates, and boundaries. The more we read, the clearer it became. The HOA had no right over that land. They had no control. They had no say. They were simply wrong. Still, we knew this fight would not be easy. People in power rarely admit mistakes quickly, and when a group like the HOA points a finger, they expect you to bow your head. But we were done bowing. We were ready to move forward with strength, respect, and proof. My wife held those land papers like they were pieces of her heart. Her voice was gentle but firm when she said, "They won't take this from me. Not again. Not ever." And in that moment, I realized this was more than a fight about chickens. It was a fight about respect, about dignity, about standing your ground, even when someone tries to push you down. We didn't know what the HOA would do next. We didn't know who was behind the complaint. But we knew one thing for sure. We were not going anywhere. The morning after we received that heavy envelope, my wife woke up with a different kind of strength in her voice. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. The kind of clarity people feel when they're tired of being pushed, tired of being ignored, and tired of being treated like they don't matter. She sat at the kitchen table with her cup of tea, looked at me and said, "We're not waiting anymore. It's time to act." And she was right. This fight wasn't just about chickens. It was about respect. It was about fairness. It was about standing up to people who misuse power. So we decided to do something the HOA never imagined we would do. We hired a land surveyor and a real property attorney to review every detail of her land boundaries. If the HOA wanted proof, we were going to give them proof they couldn't deny, twist, or ignore. The surveyor arrived 2 days later, carrying tools and maps that looked older than the HOA itself. He walked the entire property line step by step, measuring everything with extreme care. My wife followed him, pointing out old markers her grandmother had told her about. The surveyor listened, took notes, and checked every inch. After a few hours, he turned to my wife and said something that made her eyes shine with relief. "You're correct. This land is yours. Fully and clearly. And it always has been." He printed out a fresh map, signed it, stamped it, and said, "This will shut them down." For the first time in weeks, my wife let out a real, honest smile. A small one, but a powerful one. A smile that said, "They can't bully me anymore." But we didn't stop there. We took the survey, the old land records, the signed boundaries, and every legal document we had, and we sent them to the attorney. He reviewed everything line by line. After a long pause, he looked at us and said, "They have no authority over this land, no right to make demands, no right to issue fines. If they push you again, they're violating property laws." Hearing that felt like a weight falling off our shoulders. For weeks, my wife had been carrying the stress of being treated unfairly. But now, she had truth, facts, and law on her side. And when a quiet person gains confidence from truth, they become unstoppable. The attorney helped us draft a strong but respectful letter. A letter that was not emotional, not angry, but powerful. Every line had purpose. Every sentence had clarity. It explained the history of the land. It explained the legal boundaries. It explained the survey results. And it explained the HOA's lack of authority in simple terms even they could understand. At the bottom, the attorney added one more line, a line that made the HOA's power shake. It said, "Any further attempts to control or regulate this land will be considered harassment, and legal action will follow." When my wife read that line aloud, I could hear strength in her voice again, the kind of strength that comes from finally feeling seen and finally feeling protected. We printed the letter, put it into an envelope, and mailed it to the HOA with tracking. And then we waited. The next day, something strange started happening. Board members who usually avoided us suddenly began acting friendly. One waved from across the street. Another pretended he just happened to be passing by. When he walked near our driveway, it felt wrong. It felt forced, like people who realized they had messed with the wrong family and were now trying to look harmless. 2 days later, an email arrived from the HOA. My wife opened it slowly, and when she read it, she didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked tired. The email said the HOA needed more time to review the documents. That was their new excuse, their new delay, their new way of pretending they still had control. But we knew what this really meant. They were stalling because they were scared. Scared of being wrong. Scared of being exposed. Scared of facing consequences. Still, my wife didn't let frustration take over. She took a deep breath and said, "Fine. If they want time, they can take time. Because we have everything we need. And they know it." We went back to our regular routine. Feeding the chickens. Walking the land. Sitting on the porch. But even in those quiet moments, we could feel it. The tension in the air. The sense that something big was coming. The feeling that this fight still wasn't over. Late one evening, just as the sun dipped low, lighting the sky in soft orange and purple, my wife looked out the land and whispered, "Grandma would be proud." Her voice had peace in it, but also a hint of sadness. This fight had taken energy from her, but it had also awakened something powerful inside her, the strength to protect what was hers. We didn't know what the HOA would do next, but we knew one thing for sure. We were ready. This time, we were not the ones afraid. This time, they were. A few days after the HOA sent that vague email, something strange started happening in our neighborhood. People began whispering, not about us, but about the HOA board. It seemed like the truth was spreading faster than the board could hide it. Neighbors who hardly ever spoke suddenly stopped by with curious smiles, asking gentle questions like, "Is it true your land is older than HOA? Or, did they really try to fine you for chickens on your own property?" My wife always answered politely. She never complained. She never spoke badly about anyone. But people could see the hurt she had gone through. And older folks, especially those above 60, know unfairness when they see it. They know what it feels like to be pushed by people who think power belongs on paper, not in the heart. Then one evening, something unexpected happened. A woman from down the street knocked on our door. She was in her 70s, kind-faced, with gentle eyes that carried decades of wisdom. When we opened the door, she said softly, "I heard what they're doing to you, and I want you to know you're not alone." My wife invited her in, and they sat together at the table. The woman explained that years ago, she had faced a similar situation. The HOA had tried to force her to remove a small garden she planted in her front yard. They claimed it did not match the neighborhood aesthetic. She fought back, but the board ignored her for months. Eventually, she won, but she said those months were some of the most stressful of her life. My wife listened quietly, her eyes softening. Hearing that someone else had suffered under the same group made her realize something important. This wasn't just her fight. This was a pattern, a history, a habit of the HOA trying to control things that were never theirs. The woman held my wife's hand gently and said, "Don't let them break your spirit. People like them, they only stop when someone brave stands up." My wife nodded, and I could see a spark in her eyes again, a spark of courage, respect, and quiet strength. The next morning, another surprise came. A different neighbor, an older gentleman with a slow walk and a warm smile, stopped by and said, "If you ever need someone to speak at the next HOA meeting, I'll stand with you." That offer meant more to my wife than anything. She thanked him with heartfelt sincerity. It became clear that the community was shifting, slowly, quietly, but powerfully. People were tired of the HOA's rigid rules and cold attitudes, tired of being treated like children, tired of board members acting like kings. My wife became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of fairness, of reason, of someone who simply wanted to live in peace. But of course, the HOA didn't like this shift. 3 days later, we received yet another letter. This one was thick, filled with pages of rules, citations, and statements that made very little sense. It felt like they were trying to bury us in paperwork, hoping we would get tired and give up. But what they didn't know was that every new letter only made my wife stronger. She read every line carefully. She made notes. She underlined important parts. She compared their claims to the land documents. And every time she found something wrong, she smiled softly and said, "They really don't know what they're doing." That night, she turned to me and said, "We're taking this to the HOA meeting. I'm tired of letters. I'm tired of confusion. They will hear the truth face to face." So we prepared. We gathered every paper, every map, every survey, every legal note. My wife placed them neatly in a folder, holding it like it was a shield and a sword, not for war, but for justice. The night of the meeting arrived. The room was small but full. Older neighbors sat quietly in chairs. Board members sat up front, pretending to look calm but shifting uneasily. It was clear they knew this moment was coming. They just didn't expect it to be this strong. My wife stood up when her name was called. She walked to the front, steady and confident. She placed her documents on the podium, took a breath, and began speaking with the calm, clear voice of a woman who was done being pushed. She explained everything, slowly, respectfully, but with undeniable truth. She told them about her grandmother. She told them about the land. She told them about the survey. She told them about the laws. She told them everything they refused to hear before. The room was silent. Not a single person interrupted her. Even the board members stared at her with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. When she finished, she held up the stamped survey report and said, "This land is not under HOA authority. You have no right to demand anything from it." Then she looked him in the eye and added, "And I expect an apology." You could almost hear hearts pounding. For a moment, no one spoke. Not even a whisper. Not even a breath. The power in the room had shifted completely. The truth had won. And my wife had finally reclaimed her voice. But what happened next would surprise everyone, even us, because the HOA didn't just stay silent. They made a foolish decision. A decision that would push this fight into its final and most dramatic chapter. After that silent, heavy moment in the HOA meeting, everyone in the room waited for board to respond. But instead of admitting their mistake, instead of apologizing, the head of the HOA cleared his throat, sat up straight, and said something so foolish it left the room stunned. He said, "We still believe the chickens violate community standards." The entire room shifted. People exchanged looks. Some sighed. Some shook their heads. And my wife, she just stood there quietly, her face calm, her hand steady on the folder. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She didn't break. She simply replied, "Community standards do not override land ownership, and you have no legal power on my property." The board members whispered to each other nervously. They looked through their papers like they were searching for something to save themselves. But deep inside, they knew the truth. They were caught. They were wrong. And everyone in that room could see it. Suddenly, an older man from the audience raised his hand. He had been living in the neighborhood for over 30 years. His voice was firm as he said, "Stop harassing people. This is embarrassing. You have no right over her land. Let this go." Another woman stood up and added, "We are tired of your unfair rules. This family has shown you proof. What more do you want?" The head of the HOA tried to keep control, but it was slipping through his fingers. The room no longer respected him. The neighbors who once stayed quiet were now speaking boldly. Their voices carried years of frustration, years of being pushed around, years of being ignored. My wife stood there watching all of this, her heart full, her eyes soft. She had never asked anyone to support her, yet here they were, standing with her, speaking for her, protecting her. Sometimes strength grows quietly, and sometimes it inspires others without even trying. Finally, the board's lawyer, who had been sitting silently at the side of the room, leaned toward the head board member and whispered something. The head member's face changed instantly. His shoulders dropped, his eyes lowered, and he finally spoke the words everyone had been waiting to hear. "We will no longer pursue this matter." The room breathed out all at once. Some nodded, some smiled. My wife closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of weeks of stress finally lift off her shoulders. The board added, We apologized for any inconvenience caused. It wasn't the strongest apology. It wasn't heartfelt, but it was enough. It was their way of admitting they were wrong, without saying the full truth out loud. But we didn't need their heart. We only needed their surrender. My wife walked back to her seat with quiet dignity. People around her whispered, "Good job. You were brave. Well done." She thanked each one with a gentle smile. When we left the meeting that night, the air felt lighter. The stars above seemed brighter. Even the walk to our car felt peaceful, as if the world had been waiting for this justice to fall into place. On the drive home, my wife looked out the window and said softly, "Grandma would be proud." Her voice held pride, relief, and the deep calm of someone who stood for truth and won. And when we reached home, the chickens were still clucking happily in the soft night light, living their peaceful lives, unaware that their place in this world had been so fiercely defended. My wife knelt beside the coop, touched the wooden frame, and whispered, "We did it." I watched her shoulders relax, watched her eyes fill with quiet emotion, watched her finally feel safe again on a land that had been hers all along. The fight had been long. It had been heavy. It had been unfair. But she never gave up. She never backed down. She never let anyone take what belonged to her family. In the end, truth stood strong. Respect returned. Peace came home. And the HOA learned one simple lesson. You cannot take what you do not own. Final cite. If you believe no one should be bullied for protecting what's theirs, then share stories like this. Stand strong. Stand true. And never let anyone take away what belongs to your heart.